it does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. Samuel Adams, Sons of Liberty. Hear ye! Hear ye! Listen to me, gentlemen! Order! Order! I have been ordered by the governor of Boston to unload this ship of tea, and I will not leave here until each and every barrel of tea is out of this ship, and then I will sail off to the harbor. Get out of here! Get out of here! I have orders from the governor, and I will carry out my duty. You're a traitor! Get out of here! No tea in Boston! No tea in Boston! Order! Order, men! Enough! Sir Samuel Adams wishes to speak. Look at all we have endured. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Acts. Look at what we have overcome. Look at what they had repealed. We have boycotted their goods. We have all but stopped completely buying anything coming from England. But that is not enough. Nothing more can happen at this meeting to make us a free country. So we will end this meeting now. Sons of Liberty, rise! Our protests have been effective, but tonight we try something different. Tonight we try something that will set fire of freedom in the hearts of men. Prepare yourselves. Get ready in full attire, for tonight we make a statement that will be heard around the world. We have all seen the Indians, the natives, and now it is time to use their attire. Get dressed, men. Put feathers on your head. War paint on your faces. Looking very good. For in these costumes, they won't be able to identify us. The king won't know who did what we're about to do. We will appear to be the Mohawk, but they'll know who it was. For tonight, the Sons of Liberty make a statement that will be heard around the world, with feathers and war paint, and the screams of liberty and freedom will be heard all around the world. Grab your spears and grab your shields. Put on your finest jackets, because tonight we have a tea party. All right, make way toward the ship. Make way toward the ship. Here we go. Here we go. Make way toward the ship. You can see it's in the harbor. Now, when we get on there, we have to act fast. I want you to move throughout that ship. I want you to find every single barrel, because tonight we are going to turn the harbor around. We will use the darkness, the cover of night, and by the time they realize we were there, we will already be gone. We target not one, not two, but 3 ships, and we will remove every last bit of their cargo, and we will remove every last bit of spirit and will that Parliament has to fight us in England. They will acknowledge that we are free, that we are sovereign, that we have control over our own destiny. They tried to tell us that they can tax us the same way they tax the citizens of England. Well, we will not accept taxation without representation. We will not go by silently when we do not have a voice to represent us properly. We, the people of Massachusetts, have sovereignty, determination over our own destiny, and tonight we will show a king that we stand defiance of him. There's the other ship, the Eleanor. All right, we're going to make our approach. We just have to wait. It'll get a little darker. There it is. Row! 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 Row, men! Row! Board the ship. Get every last barrel. Pass them. Pass the barrels. Ah! Ah! As Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. Open the barrels. Pour the tea into the harbor. Let's go. Every last bit of tea. We're going to turn this harbor brown. Come on, quick. We have to do it before the British see us. Come on, guys. Ah! Is that the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, men? Tonight, the fish swim with every barrel of tea coming from England. Tonight, we had a Boston Tea Party. This is the British East India Company, and they played a major role in the scene you just saw. Because in 1773, 5,000 Bostonians held a meeting. They got together and they were discussing, as we saw here, tea coming into Boston Harbor. Because as we learned about previous acts, previous taxation put on the American colonists by the King of England all the way across the ocean, right? They had already taxed sugar with the Sugar Act. They had taxed paper with the Stamp Act. And of course, with what we learned last week, a tax on paper, I mean, that's how they communicated back then. That was, it was like sending a tweet today or going onto Facebook or YouTube. It was like picking up your cell phone and making a call, because back then, if you wanted to communicate with someone that lived 30 minutes away, you better send a letter, right? I mean, think about it. They didn't have cars. That was their speech. That was their communication. But they protested the Stamp Act. They protested the Sugar Act, and they were repealed. But there was one thing that the King of England, the Parliament of England, the government of England would not back down. They said, you will pay taxes on tea. Well, on that night in 1773, 5,000 people, and this was in an age before the internet. I mean, think about the logistics, the planning that goes into this. 5,000 angry Massachusettsians. I don't know if that's a word or not, but 5,000 angry colonists got together and held a meeting. And they voted right then and there, all 5,000 of them, that they would not allow tea to be unloaded off of British ships into the American colonies, because they did not want to pay a tea tax. And the King of England, he was not going to repeal the Tea Act. They were taxing the tea. Well, on that night, the captain of that ship actually got in front of these 5,000 men and said that he had an order from the governor that he had to unload the tea. And that's when this man, the man you saw right here, Samuel Adams. Now, this is a caricature of him, and they often show him holding a beer, which is rather insulting to what a great man he was. But Samuel Adams stands up in front of these 5,000 men and says, enough. He said, there's nothing more we can accomplish at this meeting. And he walks out. Now, Sam Adams, he was the head of a group called the Sons of Liberty. And those Sons of Liberty walked out of the room and they followed him. And when they did, they got together and they forged a plan. A plan that was probably already hatched out, especially by their wardrobe change. But they would all change into the clothing of Native Americans, of Indians. They'd wear feathers and war paint. Now, why do you think they didn't want to be seen? Why do you think they decided to dress up as Native Americans? Well, understand what they were doing was very dangerous, and we're going to get more into how dangerous it was. But they were so angry over this tax on tea that this was their plan. They were going, at first they tried boycotts. At first they said, we will not buy British tea, and then they went to an outright protest. Now, we could talk about how appropriate that protest was or wasn't, but they had had enough. So they dressed up as Indians, and in the dark of the night, they approached these ships, 3 ships, and they boarded the ships, and they took, I believe, 300-something barrels of tea, and they threw them into the harbor. So much tea that the harbor, according to first-hand accounts, actually turned brown. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they said. Now, why was the tea tax put in place in the first place? Why was it there? Why did the King of England feel it's so necessary to keep his tax on tea, the Parliament to keep their tax on tea, even though they had already backed down, right? They had already repealed the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Well, the reason they repealed the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act is the businesses over in England went to the king and went to Parliament and said, the colonists have been protesting and they haven't purchased any of our goods. The businesses in Britain went to the king and said, please stop taxing them, just end the Sugar Act, end the Stamp Act, and let us get back to doing business. And Parliament and the king, they said, all right. And why were the colonists able to do this? Remember who they were. These were welders. These were farmers. These were carpenters. These were engineers. These were very capable people. They owned their own businesses. They grew their own food. And because of that, when they were taxed by what they viewed as an oppressive body, a tyrant, they said, we don't need you. And they severed ties with all British businesses, and they were so capable. They had so many skills. They did apprenticeships. They started businesses. They hired their friends. They were independent enough. They were free enough. Not because they got their freedom from a king or because they got their freedom from the local government. They got their freedom from the manner in which they lived their life. So when a tyrant came along and tried to take away that freedom, now, there are multiple perspectives, right? The King of England will tell you, what do you mean I'm a tyrant? The colonists were involved in the French and Indian War 20 years earlier, and the French were right there, and I had my army there protecting them, and they think they shouldn't have to help me pay for that. He would say, I'm not a tyrant. They are not paying their fair share. There's a perspective for everything, right? Now, I come from a more American perspective, but one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So you always want to understand all sides of what's happening. So the colonists, the way they lived their lives empowered them to be free enough in which they didn't have to buy anything coming from England. They said, we'll make it ourselves. I'll make my own shoes. I'll sew my own clothes. And they did it. And it worked. But the Tea Act, it was originally part of the Townshend Acts, but they made a second part of it, the Tea Act. Which essentially gave a business in England a monopoly. They were the only ones allowed to sell tea to the colonists over in the Americas. So the British East India Tea Company went to the King of England, and they said, listen, the colonists have been completely boycotting our tea. And I know that, we tried to tax teas from other places so they'd have to buy our tea, but they got these guys. They have these guys like John Hancock, right? And you'll hear more about him, they have their ships, and they've been smuggling tea in from other countries into the Americas and buying this tea. And they're not buying our tea, they're buying tea, illegal tea from other countries. So the king says, all right, I'm going to give you a monopoly. And they created the Tea Act. It made it so it was very difficult for the colonists to get tea from anyone but a few designated people, so that they basically cut out the middleman. They basically said you could only buy the tea directly from the ships that arrive in Boston, right? So when the ship gets there, right, they can't sell that tea to a local tea business over in Boston. It can't be resold, right? You have to get it directly from the ship. And the idea behind that was they would drive down the price of tea so that even if the colonists were smuggling tea from other countries, bringing in tea from other countries illegally, the illegal tea would still cost more money, right? They said the illegal tea will cost more money, and even if they're smuggling it, the colonists will cave. They'll wind up buying tea from our English-British East India Company. Well, it didn't work, and the colonists actually paid more money to break the law. They paid more money to buy illegal tea than they would pay to buy legal tea from England, because they were so angry about their freedom, their liberty, their sovereignty being violated. So the British East India Tea Company, they convinced the king that the Tea Act had to be in place. And that is such an important thing to understand, that these companies, like the British East India Tea Company, these corporations almost always play a very large part in war. They're often the driving factors behind wars. Remember last week we talked about how no war ever takes place without bank funding, right? Well, these are the ancillary factors that you have to look at when there's a big fight between two countries. You say, well, who's funding the fight, right? Who is funding the fight? The banks are funding the fight. And who's profiting? The British East India Tea Company, or these businesses or corporations that are talking to maybe the King of England, or in the modern world, the President of the United States, and they're saying, listen, this war will make me a lot of money. Always pay attention to the banks and always pay attention to the corporations. But the colonists weren't having it, and led by Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty, it's not actually known if Samuel Adams was on the ship. Most of the men who were on the ship that night, who boarded those ships and grabbed those tea boxes and threw them into the harbor, most of their names are not known, because they dressed up as Indians or natives, and they concealed their identity, because this was a major event. I mean, this was big time. In fact, they wound up throwing over $1 million worth of tea into the harbor. That's adjusted for inflation, but basically, imagine someone boarded a ship and threw $1 million worth of stuff off the ship into the water. Lost. Well, the king wasn't happy, and the British East India Tea Company wasn't happy. This was King George III, the King of England. And of course, the Tea Act. So after the Tea Act, after these protests, they started with protests, right? But after this boycott of British tea, this act of vandalism, really, where they destroyed $1 million worth of property, the King of England was pissed. Parliament was not happy. And they implemented something called the Intolerable Acts because they wanted to punish the protest, the boycott coming from Massachusetts. Now, was it effective? Well, I'll tell you this. You'll always hear about the Boston Tea Party, but what you don't hear is that colonies all over the Americas, not just in Boston, all over, were so inspired by the acts of Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty that over the next few weeks, there was incident after incident of English ships arriving in the American colonies, not just in Boston, but in the other colonies too. And they would take the tea and they were throwing it in the water. Samuel Adams, remember his quote, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men." He set brush fires of freedom in the minds of men, and his tea party started to spread all throughout the colonies, and they would protest, and they would boycott, and they would chant, "No taxation without representation," and we're going to talk more about that in the days to come. But the king was mad, and he passed the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts were a package of laws in 1774. And what they did was reinforce the authority that the government of Britain, or England, that's one and the same, had over the American colonies. And the colonies thought that these Intolerable Acts, right, also known as the Coercive Acts, that's another name for them, same thing, were a violation of their natural rights. And what they did was they actually removed, Massachusetts had a charter, which basically meant that for more or less it was supposed to be able to govern itself, right? It was supposed to have its own little government. And the Intolerable Acts removed that charter. They said England has complete and utter control over every single law and ordinance and regulation that is passed in Massachusetts. They said that, the Intolerable Act said that the pre-existing government of Massachusetts, they could no longer have meetings, right? They stopped their ability to have meetings. They said you could not assemble, you could not gather, because they didn't want the colonists to be able to plan anything anymore. They didn't want them to be able to plan another Boston Tea Party. Well, we're going to talk more and more over the next few classes or where it would go from here. Because as you know, there'd be an American Revolution fought, right? There'd be Paul Revere's famous ride, "The British are coming, the British are coming." We're going to talk more about that. And there'd be the big standoff at Lexington and Concord, and ultimately the Sons of Liberty, the same guys that were behind this Boston Tea Party, would open fire. They would shoot at the English army, and that would start the American Revolution. And then George Washington would come in, and ultimately the colonists would win the American Revolution and win their freedom. And then years later, they were trying to form a new government, and it took a few years, but ultimately they came up with the Constitution of the United States of America and the Bill of Rights. Now, I am going to read something to you. The First Amendment. Last week we covered free speech. Listen to what else is in the First Amendment. So this was important. They put this in the First Amendment to the Constitution. "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people, peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." The men who made this document understood the circumstances that were necessary for them to claim their freedom, for them to claim their sovereignty, for them to have a chance to tell what they viewed as a tyrant, someone who is oppressing them, someone who is holding them down, a bully. They said, we needed this right to assemble, we needed this right to protest in order to maintain our freedoms and our liberties. And because of that, they said, they put it in the First Amendment. And notice again, it does not say that this document gave them that right? It doesn't say that they were given the right. Think about the language. It doesn't say the citizens of America have a right to assemble and protest and redress grievances. No, it doesn't say that. What it says is, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the right of the people peaceably to assemble. It's assuming they already have the right. This is the concept of natural rights, inalienable rights, God-given rights, that this document is unique, the Bill of Rights, in that it doesn't just protect our rights. It encodes into the high law of the land that we are born with these rights. And that is something that is so unique. You go to other countries and they don't have this concept that because people are here, that they have the right to peaceably assemble, right? Say, oh, well, we have the right to assemble and talk about why we're against something the government is doing. Well, in America, it's assumed that that right is natural, we are born with it, or if you're a believer like myself, that you are endowed with these rights by God, by simply existing. All right, guys? This has been a lot of fun, and I will see you next week. We're going to talk more about protesting and boycotts and what made it possible and how it relates to this document.